Okay, let's dive in. We're looking closely at source material you've shared, focusing on, well, a really critical moment. India's economy right before independence in 1947.
Absolutely pivotal. And our mission here, is to unpack those economic conditions India inherited. Understanding that past is just crucial for grasping the path taken after 47.
Yeah.
And this source text, it details the post-independence journey, but it starts right there on the eve of independence, gives us that baseline.
And it seems pretty clear from the outset, according to this text, what the fundamental nature of British rule was.
Yes, the source states its sole purpose was really economic exploitation
Right, turning India into a supplier of raw materials for Britain.
and a captive market for British goods. It wasn't about fostering India's own development, more like leveraging it for Britain's game. That's the picture painted here.
And the source contrasts this sharply with pre-British India, doesn't it? It wasn't some undeveloped backwater.
Not at all. The text highlights this. India had its own quite sophisticated independent economy, significant manufacturing, world-renowned handicrafts.
Like the muslin textiles.
Exactly. The legendary Dhaka muslin from Bengal, the source even mentions Malmal Shahi, cloth fit for royalty. Its decline wasn't just market forces. The source implies it was systematic, removing competition.
So a deliberate reshaping of the economy for colonial interests. And the source suggests the economic data, or lack thereof, reflects this suppression.
Very much so. The text notes there weren't really any sincere colonial efforts to even estimate national income properly.
Hmm.
And the individual estimates cited Noroji, Rao, Desai, and others, they often conflicted but pointed towards stagnation. The source mentions aggregate real output growing less than 2% in the first half of the 20th century.
Less than 2%.
But the really telling figure for the average person is per capita output. The source says it grew by a meager 0.5% annually.
0.5%. So over decades, basically no real improvement for individuals on average.
Pretty much. It helps explain the extensive poverty the source confirms existed.
And this hit the agricultural sector hardest, where, what, 85% of the population live?
Yes, the vast majority. And the source describes stagnation, even deterioration there,
Right.
despite more land coming under cultivation.
So why was that, according to the text?
A key factor highlighted is the land settlement systems, like the zamindari system.
Okay.
The issue, as the source puts it, was that the profits went to the zamindars, the landlords, whose main interest was just collecting rent, not investing in the land, not improving techniques, not really caring for the cultivators' well-being.
So no investment back into the farms.
Right. Combine that with low technology, lack of irrigation, hardly any fertilizer use. The source points to dismal productivity, immense hardship for the actual farmers.
And the push for cash crops like cotton or indigo for British factories.
Well, the source says that while it increased yields in some specific areas, it often didn't improve the farmer's economic condition. And critically, it shifted production away from food crops needed locally, plus little investment in vital things like terracing or flood control.
Okay, so agriculture was struggling. What about industry?
The source is quite blunt. No sound, modern industrial base was developed. The famous Indian handicrafts declined systematically.
Creating unemployment.
Yes, massive unemployment. And the demand was then met by, well, cheap British imports. It fits the pattern, raw materials out, finished goods in. That's the motive the source identifies.
But some modern industry did start. The source mentions cotton, jute.
It did, but slowly. Second half of the 19th century mainly. Cotton and jute mills started, cotton often by Indians in Maharashtra and Gujarat, jute more by foreigners in Bengal.
And steel later?
Iron and steel came later, yes.
Huh.
Tisco, Tata Iron and Steel, founded 1907, is the key example cited. A few others like sugar, cement, paper popped up after World War II, but it was limited.
And a crucial point the text makes is the lack of capital goods.
Exactly. Hardly any industry producing the machine tools, the machinery needed to build other industries. That really stunted further industrialization potential. The public sector was also very limited. Railways, power, communications, ports mainly serving colonial administration and movement.
Which brings us to foreign trade. Also restrictive, according to the source.
Deeply restrictive colonial policies. India became an exporter of primary products, raw silk, cotton, sugar, indigo, jute.
Or raw materials again?
Yes, and an importer of finished consumer goods and capital goods like machinery, mostly from Britain. Britain held a monopoly, essentially. Over half of India's trade was just with Britain. The Suez Canal opening in 1869 just tightened that grip.
And this generated a large export surplus for India.
It did, characteristically. But the source argues this came at a huge cost. Essential goods became scarce domestically.
Ah, so the surplus wasn't beneficial.
The source calls it the drain of Indian wealth. That surplus didn't translate into gold or silver flowing into India for development. Instead, it was used to pay for Britain's expenses, their administrative office in London, costs of wars fought by the British, other invisible imports, wealth flowing out.
Wow, so surplus is misleading. It was wealth being extracted. What about the people?
Yeah.
The demographics?
Grim picture there, too, based on the source. The first proper census was 1881. 1921 is seen as a transition point, but population growth wasn't initially that high. Social indicators were poor, literacy below 16%.
16, that's incredibly low.
And female literacy, even worse, around 7%. Public health was inadequate, leading to rampant water and airborne diseases, high mortality rates. Infant mortality was alarming, the source quotes, 218 per thousand.
Goodness. Compared to maybe 28 now?
A huge difference. Life expectancy was shockingly low, just 32 years, the source says, compared to around 69 today. Extensive poverty was the reality.
And where people work, the occupational structure, did that change much?
Very little change, according to the source. Agriculture remained dominant, maybe 70–75% of the workforce. Manufacturing was stagnant around 10%, services 15–20%.
So no real shift towards a modern economy structure.
Not fundamentally. There were some regional variations mentioned. Madras, Bombay, Bengal saw a slight shift away from agriculture. But places like Orissa, Rajasthan, Punjab actually saw an increase in the share working in agriculture. Overall, an underdeveloped picture.
And infrastructure.
Yeah.
Railways, ports, telegraphs, they existed, but the source argues.
They were developed primarily for colonial interests. Mobilizing the army, getting raw materials to the ports efficiently. Roads, especially all-weather roads to rural areas, were lacking.
Railways are often cited as a benefit, though.
The source acknowledges they were important, introduced in 1850, but it presents a dual effect. Yes, they broke down some geographical barriers, but they also facilitated British exploitation and potentially damaged village self-sufficiency. The economic loss, the source suggests, often outweighed social benefits for many Indians. Other things like inland waterways weren't really developed for public use effectively. Postal services served the administration. The telegraph was mainly for law and order.
Okay, so pulling all this together from the source material, India at independence faced, well, just immense challenges.
Absolutely. Agricultural stagnation, a desperate need for industrial modernization and diversification, huge public investment needed, trade needed complete reorientation, infrastructure needed upgrading for India's needs, and rampant poverty and unemployment demanded urgent welfare focus.
An economy profoundly shaped, perhaps deliberately constrained over 2 centuries.
Precisely. Now, the source text does mention, almost in passing, this perception that British administration did have some benefits. But considering everything we've just unpacked from this source, the deindustrialization, the systems crippling agriculture, that calculated drain of wealth, the poor health outcomes, the infrastructure built for colonial profit, how might you, reflecting on this evidence presented in the source, critically appraise that notion of benefits? Something to think about.